Hey guys, so very recently I provided a breakdown of the most played hand traps and staples at YCS Indianapolis, and as usual I also wanted to provide a tier list of the best hand traps and staples for this month using data from Dueling Book as well as also from these topping deck lists. And also you can always check out my previous videos in terms of how the tier scores are actually calculated. As usual, definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies. I actually want to highlight that Dragon Shield actually has discount codes now, so you can use code Hakuna5 for 5% off for their sleeves. So let's get right into the staple tier list for this month, and we're of course going to start with Ash Blossom. This is not a surprise because this is of course the most played hand trap among the topping deck lists in terms of YCS Indie as well as some events before that. Really super generic, can hit just about anything right now, and it's kind of like the safest option in terms of hand traps. If you want to have like the most versatility, I guess, in terms of main deck, of course it is a lot of times can be not as high impact and perhaps also helps you play into talents or thrusts by your opponent. And then we also have Feather Duster, so of course, no drawbacks, just blow up back row is also seen in majority of the topping deck lists for YCS Indie and usually in a lot of different events as well. And then you of course have Imperm, which of course is very versatile, kind of up there in terms of Ash, in terms of how often it's played, regardless of what format you're in. But nonetheless, right now of course we have Rescue Ace, which was the most represented deck at YCS Indie, and being able to like stop or at least try to stop the turbulence set 4 with Imperm is always kind of nice. Of course, they certainly have ways to like get around that as well. Imperm against, let's say, something like Tearlaments, I feel like the only time where it's like actually high impact is, let's say, like Diviner and they're trying to send like any of the millers, so you improve them and just like hope that they don't have anything else, but nonetheless I think it's still quite versatile and can be used against pretty much every deck. So next we have Nibiru, which certainly is a very high impact card, definitely been flipping back and forth in terms of the last couple of months, but nonetheless really strong card right now. You have something like, you still have like Unchained against Tearlaments. I'm told if they're not on like the King of the Swamp package, which means no Recalos, Nibiru can be a lot better in that regard as well. Against Rescue Ace, they can also play into Nibiru, so that's something where you can consider this card right now, especially Imperm plus Nibiru against pretty much most strategies. That's usually like game ending, so that's always nice to have. And another very high impact hand trap that you should probably consider in your side is Droll and Lockbird, which has also been seeing a little more play recently compared to let's say like from YCS Vancouver where it kind of dropped off. But now you also have like something like Mannadium where you really need Droll against that, and even like some random rogue strategies, let's say like Dark World. Honestly, if you don't have Droll against Dark World and you lose the die roll, like you're honestly probably gonna have a pretty bad time. So basically I think these 5 cards in the tier A section like really represents like cards that are pretty much in like most people's, at least the topping deck list, side deck and or main deck. And then moving on to the B tier, we have something like Triple Tactics Talent, of course, which really goes hand in hand with something like Thrust. Both are very strong, not in every list, but in a lot of lists, and you kind of expect it at this point, especially, because they are very versatile in terms of going first and or second. And also Thrust, it kind of depends on your deck as well in a sense, because if you have something like a very strong spell, let's say that kind of works with like your in-engine, let's say a prime example is something like Brand Infusion, like you're probably always on Thrust because it's just so good whether you go first or second. We also have Bestial Druism, of course, a little bit more popular than Magmanaut, just because I guess in terms of like the Unchained matchup, like it is better, but at the same time, like let's say with Tearlaments, Bestials are also always really good, and having Magmanaut, while only being at 1 now, is still of course better to have in that scenario. And then we also have Lightning Storm, which of course is very strong. Like you have like something like Rescue Ace, like set 4, like if you can get through the Omni Negate, like being able to blow out the back row is always nice. So like kind of in line with Feather Duster, it's like been seeing a lot of play lately, and luckily we're not actually seeing a lot of Ibly lock happening among the Rescue Ace list, which would basically make something like Lightning Storm or even like evenly matched dead. So this card is still seeing a good amount of play and has a place in this meta. And of course, we already kind of briefly spoke about Magmanaut. It is put to 1, but it's still putting in the work for now. And then we of course have Kashira Fenrir, which I guess with the Bestials, they both came out in Darkwing Blast and still kicking really strong year after release. Really good card going first and second. It's going to be in like a lot of people's lists. It doesn't matter what kind of deck you're playing, other than like let's say something like Thunder. Like you're really probably going to get used to seeing this a lot. And then we also have Evenly Match, which, is a generic, really good board wipe. It still actually saw a pretty good amount of play, even though it was kind of like slightly ticking down in the last event or two. One thing about Evenly Match I've been experiencing so far in this early post-Age of Overlord format, and I also noticed GGYGO, who you should also check out, of course, he also commented on this, is that if they have SP Little Knight, they can always like banish their knight and just like another monster, like in reaction to Evenly Match, and then, they don't really neg as hard as they once would have without SP. So that is something to consider for like the way I see with evenly. Like the reason I play it at least is because, you know, I'm trying to play around like, let's say like anti-spell fragrance, because the deck that I play, branded, kind of hard loses to that. So in that situation, I think that's why I'm still sticking with evenly, especially because, let's say, even though anti-spell actually is not seeing that much play, at least in the topping list, fortunately, but that's also because there weren't a lot of Unchained that topped, and Unchained has, at least up until now, has been kind of known to play anti-spell on this side. And so just swing out to, because they don't have like an Omni Negate on board, at least evenly can hopefully deal with that. So that's one of the reasons. Now, some cards that I don't think YGO can identify properly, or at least not this time around, were Xyz Encore and Herald Abyss, but I still wanted to put this manually on this tier list just because they actually did see a pretty good amount of play in the topping deck list at YCS Indianapolis. Xyz Encore is kind of interesting because, of course, it saw play, started seeing play again because of, let's say, Purrely Noir, but, you know, previous format we also had Arise hard to deal with, and Xyz Encore could deal with that. Nowadays, we have Noir, but maybe even something like Abyss Dweller is something that you can kind of deal with Xyz Encore, especially because, you know, they're probably shotgunning the Dweller effect, and even for playing a deck like, let's say, Tearlaments or, I don't know, Unchained, you know, Xyz Encore on Dweller is probably pretty nice. Herald Abyss was also seeing good amount of play, especially because it can actually be searched under Thrust. So those are some pretty good board breaker options that you can consider as well in your list. So next we of course have Dimension Shifter, which is certainly like one of the most hated cards in the current game. Usually does not score very high just because only certain decks can play it, you know, most notably Thunder, but of course, you know, let's say even like a Rika deck list that topped also sided this, even though they don't play optimally. Same can be said for, there were actually some Purrely lists, even a Rescue Ace list that would side Shifter, just because they can at least kind of play under it. At least for Purrely, when they're going second, they can at least, you know, use Shifter. If they're going first and someone shifters them, that from what I'm told, it is still pretty impactful. But nonetheless, there are a lot of decks that can, you know, kind of play around, or at least sort of play under Shifter, so they can side it against decks that completely die to Shifter like Tearlaments. So certainly something to watch out for. Droplet, kind of poetic that it's right next to Shifter, because under Shifter, of course, you know, you cannot use Droplet. At the same time, I really like this card. I think it's great, just being able to, you know, quick effect negate. I think it's a great main deck option just because it's so flexible, because, you know, it is a quick play, so you can use it going first or second. Of course, you know, unlike something like Dark Ruler, at least right now, you know, back when Sprite format, like when those were tier 1 decks, you know, a lot of people were main decking Dark Ruler, as you would have seen in my breakdowns during that time. But right now, I think Droplet is a really good choice, and that's that modification, attack halving, can actually really come up, especially because you're probably doing that in damage step when your opponent's attacking into you, and it can really catch them off guard, especially when during the damage step, you know, there's not many effects that you can actually activate at that time. Solemn Judgment, so this is kind of like usually a Dueling Book staple. You see a lot of play on Dueling Book compared to, like, let's say IRL events, but this time around there are actually a decent amount of lists that were siding this card, especially notably Rescue Ace were siding Solemn Judgment. So you know what, curious to see whether this will stay at 3, especially when Red Reboot is put to, banned. And then we also have DD Crow, which along the lines of Bestial has interactions where, you know, again, something like Tearlaments or even like, let's say, Unchained can be useful, but most notably it can at least banish spells and traps. So the Purrely matchup it at least is useful there, whereas Bestials against Purrely is honestly pretty bad. So you know what, DD Crow can be pretty decent and has its own place. Super Poly is another interesting thing that I noted in the previous YCS Indie Top Cup breakdown video, where, you know, we didn't even have like any like branded lists, at least among the ones that were publicly available, and yet you were still seeing Super Poly because, you know, it's, I guess, depending on the deck that you play and you have a flexible extra deck, you can certainly make space for it, especially something like Draco Exquisite is a kind of like a new hot target against something like, you know, when you're facing like a Barone plus Savage or a Barone plus like this pattern, for example. And then you have like your usual, you know, Garura, Mud Dragon, or even Dragostapelia, which can certainly come up. And then we have Call by the Grave. This has honestly been declining for the last little while. I mean, it's generic, you know, if you're a deck that completely loses to certain head traps, let's say, you know, Branded and Ash or Mannadium and Droll, like, yeah, I'm sure you're still playing Call by. Otherwise, it's not as versatile as it once was, I find, especially in a format like, let's say, like when DPE was just like in everyone's deck. That was really good for not only hand traps, but stopping DPE. But you know what, I guess right now we also have like some Tearlaments stuff going on, so Call by the Grave is still pretty strong if you can fit it. And then we also have Book of Eclipse. This is another card that's been declining, especially with like kind of like Arise Heart being gone. I mean, there's still like good use for it, especially this being non-targeting can also really help, right? Especially like, let's say, for example, like any kind of Chimera builds, you know, they have the Cornfield for like the target protection as well. So it's always kind of nice and can like still catch people off guard. But of course, one thing to consider is this can be Ash. And then another card that I'm really glad that is not seeing that much play, at least at YCS Indie, is D-Berry, which of course can be very good against something like Purrely, calling Xyz, against something like, let's say, Branded, calling Fusion. But, you have decks right now that are, like, really strong. Let's say, for example, like Rescue Ace or even Unchained, where, like, D-Berry is not going to do too much. Of course, against Tearlaments, at least it's still strong. But against, something like Thunder, it's also dead. So it's, like, super hit or miss. I mean, if you're playing Thrust and you have, like, a spot to fit one D-Berry, sure, why not? But for the most part, it actually was not seeing that much play in the topping deck list. And then moving on to the final tier, we have Dark Ruler no more. This has definitely been falling a lot. It's not to say that it doesn't have any kind of place in the meta or anything, or that it's bad. I mean, it's still a good card. It's just more so that I think, in my view, it's just not as something that we have to primarily rely on anymore to break the current boards in this current format, compared to something like, let's say, any kind of like Sprite format when they're tier 1. Like, yeah, they spit out a lot of things at once, and you have to kind of, Dark Ruler is really nice in that regard. But right now in this current format, you have something like Purrely Noir, Dark Ruler is not going to do anything. You have other decks like, let's say, Chimera, Tearlaments, where you have like a lot of like layered interruptions. Same thing can be said for also Unchained, where they can certainly play through Dark Ruler. They have like a lot of things that float and just come back, and just a lot of different layers. So that's why I think Dark Ruler has certainly fallen off. But it's something maybe you can even play as like a one-of if you also play Thrust. And then we also have Effect Veiler, which of course not nearly as good as Imperm, especially when you're playing to Talents and Thrust. But you know what? Steven Santelli's first place Rescue Ace list, I believe, was playing Effect Veiler, so that has to mean something, right? And finally, we have Cosmic Cyclone. This is another card that, honestly, a couple months ago was very high on this tier list, as well as, the topping deck list, like a lot of them were playing. So in a way, I'm actually kind of surprised this has fallen this much. Of course, we've seen like a lot of decline in the play of like Runic, Sprite, Verhire, or, I guess Live Twin decks. So maybe that explains partly, but you still have some random Runic variants here and there. I mean, including the one that actually topped this YCS Indianapolis event. And you have something like, I don't know, like Purrely, being able to banish is always kind of nice, especially when they have Happy Memory to potentially protect, like let's say they're My Friend Purrely, or let's say against Tearlaments, banishing the Select is always nicer than destroying it. And same can be said for, like let's say the Field Spell, like to prevent like the search or the potential later pops with Keldo Medora Shuffle. And against Flunder, Cosmic can also be very good as well. But you know what, I think perhaps we're just running out of space to play, be able to fit all these cards. You also have Kashira Fenrir, which can kind of act as like just like a recurring Cosmic Cyclone in a sense. Of course, Cosmic can be better in certain situations, but nonetheless, those are my thoughts. Alright, so that was it for the staple tier list for this month. Sorry that I did it so late. I definitely wanted to just wait until Age of Overlord format came out and just kind of actually have more relevant data to work with. But anyways, a huge thanks to all of you for watching the video. Big thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel, and well, take care guys.